Hey, what's up everybody? This is Superk501 and today I want to go over an overview for the Sorceress class in Diablo 4. The Sorcerer or Sorceress is going to be the archetypal caster or wizard of Diablo 4 and is going to play a very similar role to the Sorcerer from every other Diablo game. And the strengths of this class are going to lie in a massive AoE, massive amounts of crowd control, and pretty effective movement abilities, but like the sorcerers from previous Diablo games, they are going to be more of a glass cannon class. The sorcerer is going to be focused around three different elements: cold, lightning, and fire, having a bunch of abilities in all of the different categories for each one of these elements, and seeming to have a lot of different builds for each one of these elements. Now, sorcerer skills are going to be split into 6 different categories. Now, these categories don't exclude you from using any combination of skills you want, except for the ultimate category. So these categories are essentially just groupings of different skills that give you a quick idea of what that skill is going to do and how it's going to perform. So starting off, you have basic abilities, and these are going to be some of the weakest but some of the most spammable abilities for the sorcerer. If you've played any other Diablo game, you know what to expect with these. They're spammable, don't really cost any resources, and with upgrades, most of them can generally start to generate you resources. So for instance, one of them is a Frostbolt. You just throw a bolt at an enemy that deals some damage and chills that enemy, slowing them down. And that's what that ability would do at a baseline. Would have no resource cost, wouldn't generate any resource, but if you upgrade this skill, one of the upgrades allows it to start generating mana after hitting chilled or frozen enemies. So basic skills are the skills you're always going to be able to use, and if you have no other cooldowns up or resources up, you can still be spamming these skills. They're not going to be your primary source of damage. They're generally not going to be skills you build your entire character around, but they're always useful and going to generally be in every build. And next up, we have core skills, and as the name suggests, these are going to be some of your strongest and most primarily used abilities on this class. Pretty much all these are going to have a pretty high mana cost, so they're not something you're going to be able to infinitely spam. They're all generally going to be AoE abilities, and they're also going to have a lot of legendary powers that can affect them. So for instance, we have Fireball, has a mana cost of 50, and you hurl an exploding ball of fire, dealing damage to surrounding enemies. And you're probably pretty familiar with this skill if you've seen or played any other of the sorcerers from any other Diablo game. But core skills are what a lot of builds are going to be built around. They do a lot more damage, they're usually AoE based, they do cost mana, but generally they're much stronger for costing mana, and they're going to have a lot of legendary effects and other effects that are going to be able to affect them and make them much stronger. And next up, we have defensive skills, and as the name suggests, these are primarily going to be based around keeping your character alive through damage reduction, shielding, or even movement. Now on the defensive side, you have something like Flame Shield that has a 20-second cooldown, and you engulf yourself in flames for 2 seconds, burning nearby enemies for damage per second, but while the shield is active, you are fully immune to damage. But then you have something on the movement side in Teleport, which has an 11-second cooldown, and you transform into lightning, becoming unstoppable and surging to a location, dealing damage around you upon arrival. And Teleport probably being the most iconic skill of sorcerers, and one of the very big reasons why this archetype in Diablo is generally seen as having very high movement, because most builds are going to end up using teleport, and usually there's ways to manipulate or augment teleport to make it even more useful. Maybe giving a reduced cooldown, being able to teleport multiple times per cooldown, or other things like that. And generally, you're going to probably have one or more defensive skills in every single build. Because like I mentioned, most builds are probably going to have teleport, and then most builds will probably also have one of the other defensive skills to keep themselves alive as well. And next up, we have Conjuration. Now, Conjuration skills have been a pretty big staple of sorcerers for all of the Diablo games, but these are only generally used in more specialized or specific builds, or more as filler spells. For instance, we have Hydra, a mana cost of 20, and you summon a 3-headed Hydra for 8 seconds. Each head spits fire at nearby enemies, dealing damage. So unless you're creating a build specifically around one of these conjuration spells, these are usually not used or used more as a filler or additional damage. For instance, there have been a lot of builds in the past that use something similar to Hydra as an additional spell to throw out, but is not your main damage and not your main spamming abilities. And next up, we have Mastery Skills. Now these are kind of similar to core abilities, but these ones are generally more substantial and much more focused on massive, big damaging AoE spells. For instance, we have Meteor. With a 40 mana cost, you summon a meteor that strikes a target location, dealing damage and burning the ground for more damage over 3 seconds. And likewise, we have Blizzard. With a mana cost of 40, you summon a frigid blizzard that deals damage and continuously chills enemies over 8 seconds. And similar to core abilities, these are abilities that will have a lot of builds specifically focused on them. There have been many Meteor builds in the past where Meteor is your primary form of damage and the primary ability you're augmenting through different gear or effects. And it's going to be no different in Diablo 4. And that brings us to the final category, which are ultimate skills. And these work a little bit differently than all of the other skill categories, because any of the other skills we went over in any of the other categories can be used in any way you want. So if you want to have 4 core abilities on your bars, you could do that and legitimately use a build with 4 different core abilities. And you can mix and match any of the other skills from any of the other categories as you wish. But with ultimate skills, you can only have one chosen at a time. And ultimate skills are generally going to be much stronger skills than anything else you have available, but are usually going to have some really big downside, generally being a really long cooldown. And from everything I've seen in Diablo 4, it is not easy to get a lot of cooldown reduction, so it's seeming like ultimate skills are going to be that really big burst button, but you're not going to be able to massively reduce its cooldown like you could in Diablo 3. So for instance, we have Deep Freeze, has a 60-second cooldown, and you encase yourself in ice, becoming immune for 4 seconds, continually chilling enemies for 20%. When Deep Freeze ends, frozen enemies will shatter for massive damage, and you can cast this again to end it early. And that's honestly a bit more of a unique example of an ultimate skill, probably why they've shown off this skill multiple times over the years. But then you have things like Inferno with a 45-second cooldown, ignite a roaring inferno that passes in and out of a target area, dealing massive damage over 8 seconds, then explodes, dealing more damage to enemies on the outer edge. And we don't know all of the different skills that are going to be in the ultimate category, but presumably there are going to be other skills that just buff up your character as well. For instance, in Diablo 3, you had the Archon ability, which was one of the abilities that many builds were completely focused around. So that brings us to the Sorcerer's unique class mechanic. And if you don't know, every class in Diablo 4 is going to have a unique class mechanic that is generally a new customization system specific to that one class. And the Sorcerer has enchantment slots. And this is going to be a system that you unlock at level 15 that you just have to do a quest for, and you will get your first enchantment slot. Then at level 30, you get the second. And it's seeming like you're only going to be having those 2 enchantment slots through the entirety of the game. Now, these enchantment slots essentially allow you to slot in any sorcerer ability into that enchantment slot that will give you a very powerful passive effect based on what ability is in that slot. Now, I've gone over the system before, and from previous information, it was said that you wouldn't be able to use an ability as an active ability if it was already in an enchantment slot, but it seems like that has changed, and now you're able to have one ability in an enchantment slot and on your action bar at the same time. And these passive abilities are not only going to be an incredibly strong passive effect, but there's also going to be a lot of different combinations from these passives that can play into other skills on the sorcerer and can play heavily into your specific build. Now, to put a skill into an enchantment slot, you do need that skill to be learned. And you do that either by putting one of your class skill points into it, or by having a piece of gear with plus skill rank into that specific skill, because that will learn you the skill as well. And whatever skill you put in an enchantment slot will also keep all of its different upgrades. So you can upgrade a skill 5 times through your class skill tree. It'll keep those upgrades, and the different augment upgrades you get to choose through your class tree will also continue to be on that skill when in an enchantment slot. So for instance, if you put Frozen Orb into an enchantment slot, it would give you the effect of whenever you cast a non-basic skill, you have a 20% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And keep in mind, if you fully upgraded and went into Frozen Orb, this Frozen Orb that would be launched at a random enemy would also be fully upgraded, and it would have any other effects you have that affect Frozen Orbs. So even things like legendary powers that would affect a specific ability would also affect the enchantment slot passives. And again, you could also have Frozen Orb as an active ability on your action bar while also having it in that enchantment slot. So you could potentially just be spamming out Frozen Orbs everywhere. And something to note with this is that it's anytime you cast a non-basic skill, Frozen Orb isn't a basic skill, so you could also have Frozen Orb being your main damaging spamming ability, having it in an enchantment slot, and just be generating additional Frozen Orbs whenever you use a Frozen Orb. And I do think a lot of people are going to have one of these slots primarily for a defensive skill, because some of them are going to be incredibly strong, and having a very strong defensive passive effect is going to be good for pretty much any build. For instance, you have Flame Shield, which when put into an enchantment slot will automatically activate Flame Shield when you take fatal damage, but it takes 120 seconds for this effect to recharge. Now, Flame Shield is a thing that makes you immune for 2 seconds. So instead of dying every 120 seconds, you can actually just skip that death and it activates Flame Shield for you, making you immune to damage for a few seconds, essentially giving you a cheat death. And I'm betting most sorcerers playing hardcore are probably going to be using this because this is incredibly strong. So that is a general overview from the sorcerer or sorceress class. And if you like playing wizards or elementalists or mages from other RPGs, you're probably going to like the sorcerer class. It is exactly what you would expect. Massive AoE, lots of CC, but a glass cannon type of class. And also keep in mind, this is just an overview that'll give you a good idea of what the sorcerer has to offer, but I'm also still planning to do videos for every class, including the sorcerer, going over all of their abilities and their ability upgrades. Now, I'm not doing that in this same video because the video would just be ridiculously long. So I want this to be more of an overview to get a good idea of what all the classes are going to offer, to give you better information on choosing a class once the game is released. But that's pretty much all I want to go over. So subscribe if you want to see more Diablo 4 or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about the Sorceress class in Diablo 4. And thanks for watching.